I think empire has always been an underlying preoccupation of many of the sessions in Jaipur, which is particularly, which is different from many of the other festivals where there's a demonology which is centered on the very term empire, and which my friend Shashi Tharoor has done his own modest bit to enhance. I'm very fortunate that we have here today at least two people who are common in the sense that they are both practicing politicians. Shashi is a member of the Lok Sabha. He belongs to the Congress party, but we went to the same college and we started life as sort of undergraduates reading history. And I assure you, he was rather good at it. Tristram Hunt is a professional historian who has strayed into the world of politics. And I don't know how long his political tenure, at least at the top of the pile, is going to be, because at present he finds himself in a bit of a muddle over his political party, a predicament which often Shashi is confronted similarly. But we are going to talk about empire, not in the same way as Shashi did when he participated rather successfully in a very adversarial and a puerile, somewhat undergraduate debate at the Oxford Union. I hope we can elevate the levels today into having a less of a confrontational and more meaningful, but equally witty, I hope, conversation on empire. So should I start with the guest, Tristram? Is your interest in empire purely a function, and this is a silly question, abiding interest in empire, a function of the fact that you represent Stoke-on-Trent? Stoke-on-Trent, in case you know, is one of the icons of the Staffordshire pottery industry. Wedgwood, Minton, Spode, these are the names which are associated with his constituency, which, alas, has seen better days. Is it empire nostalgia of yearning for the better days?
No. Well, first of all, Swapan, let me apologize, and these are words I never thought I'd say, for not being Neil Ferguson. If you had expected more of a ding-dong between Neil and Shashi, let me apologize for that. Let me just say a few words, Swapan, about my interest, and I think where the debate about empire and imperialism in the UK is at the moment, because I think the scholarship about empire at the moment is increasingly one which looks at the imperial process as a story much more of interaction and diffusion and exchange rather than simply a hegemonic process. Similarly, it looks at the process of empire taking multiple and different forms over centuries. What happened in the plantations of Ulster in Ireland was different to what happened in Bombay, was different to what happened in Melbourne, was different to what happened in Jamaica. Over time and over centuries and over places, the nature of empire was very, very different. And I think we also appreciate, particularly in Britain now, how much empire shaped Britain, as well as Britain involved in a process along with other colonial forces of shaping the world. And so Stoke-on-Trent, for example, a community of 6 towns in a valley in North Staffordshire, very far away from some of the forces of empire. Actually, the designs that would come out of Stoke-on-Trent, the impact of Stoke-on-Trent upon empire was very forceful. Those of you who know the Bombay clock tower, those of you who know the old Victoria terminus in Bombay, the designs there, much of that would come out of Stoke. So it's a more complicated story of imperialism at the moment. But in terms of the public debate, we're very much into, at the moment, particularly in Britain, good or bad understandings of empire? Should we apologize for empire, or should we, as it were, commemorate the achievements and successes? Should the statues of Cecil Rhodes be pulled down, or should we think actually this was a man who did important things in the world? So the scholarship, I think, is separate increasingly from where the public debate is. But we also know, I think, from the public, from the scholarship, just how central empire was to the economic development and growth of Britain. The more we understand about the early slave economy, the more we understand about the role of the British in the Caribbean and the money that came from the West Indies to fund industrialization and to support the growth of Britain in those early takeoff years, means that the economic history of Britain from the 1750s onwards is so intimately bound up with the story of empire. And that's why I think Shashi, in Shashi's speech in Oxford, he raised the issue of reparations. In the Caribbean, this conversation is much more advanced, with the historian Henry Beckles making a very concerted case for the importance of European reparations to the Caribbean, not in terms of funds or just £1, but in terms of support in education and health and development. Finally, let me say this, that when you think of the story of empire in the United Kingdom, it often begins with the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, when England becomes a Protestant rather than Catholic country. And the act in restraint of appeals, when England separates itself from Rome, begins with this phrase that England is an empire. And if the empire began in England, it went into Scotland, it went into Ireland, and Great Britain became an imperial force. But now the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is somewhat in retreat. And we faced a year or so ago, a referendum on whether Scotland still wanted to be a part of the United Kingdom. And we're going to face a referendum this year as to whether Great Britain wants to be a part of Europe. So there is a huge amount of confusion as to what England and Britain is in the world today. And so some of the, I think, nostalgia or empathy for the history of empire is part of that confusion in the UK today about its place in the world. But we also saw the reality of Britain's place in the world. We had 2 state visits before Christmas by President Xi Jinping of China and Prime Minister Modi. And the power and force of these great superpowers coming to Great Britain and the willingness with which the British felt, I think, a new understanding of their place in the world relative to these forces also gave a sense of the cycle of history turning again.
Yeah, well, Shashi, anybody who's not familiar with YouTube would come to a natural conclusion that you personify the orphans of Macaulay. And yet, you've acquired a sudden and rather inexplicable reputation as a die-hard opponent of empire. Do you really hate the empire?
Absolutely, and all its works. But let me start by saying that I want to thank Swapan for his uncommonly gracious words at the beginning of this talk. I'm not accustomed to them from him. But mind you, we did in fact start our undergraduate studies in history together. Though throughout our undergraduate years, I was a supporter of the Swatantra Party and Swapan was a Trotskyite. So it's rather odd for me to be sitting to the left of him today, a position I never expected to find myself occupying. Having said that, in the interests of history, let me turn to Tristram's points. I mean, and Swapan's. In all fairness, this Macaulay Putra argument that many of the people Swapan likes to find himself in the intellectual company of is one that essentially is based on a notorious line by Thomas Babington Macaulay, where he said that the objective of British education in India ought to be to create a class of Indians, Indian in blood and color, he said, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, quote unquote. And he went on to explain that the purpose of creating this class was to serve as interpreters between the English and the millions they governed, or they intended to govern. He wrote in the 1830s. Now, to some degree, I think the British were surprised by the consequences of their creation of such a class, because this class produced some of India's most fierce and trenchant nationalists. Already within 3 decades of Macaulay's Minute, you had people like Ramesh Chandra Dutt coming up and writing really searing inquiries into the iniquities of colonialism, followed by many other English-educated people, like Dadabhai Naoroji most notably, who wrote a wonderful book about the un-British rule in India, trying to shame the British by their own professed ideals. And you also had, of course, the establishment of the Indian National Congress in 1885 by people who were principally English educated, either in India or in England or both, but had come back and realized that the ideals that they had learned through their education were not in fact practiced when it came to them in this country. So Nehru would be dismissed by many of Chopin's friends as a Macaulay Putra, but to my mind, he remains the preeminent voice of Indian nationalism in the 20th century. And if you read his works, Discovery of India in particular, but his own autobiography and other writings, you see a man who has indeed benefited from the kind of international exposure that the English language gave him, and at the same time articulated a profoundly, fiercely nationalist vision. So if anything, rather than Chopin being surprised that I have now acquired this reputation, I'm surprised that what I had to say struck such a chord among so many people, because honestly, standing in Oxford speaking to a predominantly English or white-skinned audience, I thought I may have been telling them some things they weren't fully familiar with, but that Indians, I assumed, would know everything I was saying, that this is nationalism 101, to use the American phrase. Well, it wasn't, and part of the reason is indeed the historical amnesia that both societies are suffering. I was struck by the number of voices that came out of England afterwards, including that of the leader of Tristram Hunt's own party, Jeremy Corbyn, saying after my speech that these are things that have not been actually taught in English schools. Just last week, there was an article by a Pakistani a woman who had brought her child up in one of the better public schools in London, and she was recounting that the child had never learned a single sentence about the British Empire in the South Asian subcontinent. And this is part of the problem, that when Tristram talks about some of these debates, I remember a very evocative protest in London against some of the more racist immigration policies of Mrs. Thatcher, which had a bunch of brown-skinned, presumably British citizens, holding up placards reminding the British, "We are here because you were there." And that is something that many British have allowed themselves to forget. So I agreed with Chopin's slightly snarky comment in his article on my speech that I looked slightly embarrassed to be associated with the global apology industry, as Chopin called it. And he's not entirely wrong. I mean, I, left to myself, would have inveighed against colonialism without focusing on reparations, because I genuinely believe that one cannot put a value, certainly not a monetary value, on the colossal damage inflicted by Britain on India over 200 years, or on the lives lost. I mean, just to take one figure of one wrong, but British economic historians have estimated that some 15 to 29 million Indians died completely unnecessary deaths due to man-made famines or mismanaged famines during 200 years of British rule. Now, how do you put a monetary value on that? So I would not have gone down the reparations path. Tristram is right, in the Caribbean, this is far advanced. And when Mr. Cameron came to the Caribbean, he was confronted officially with a resolution of the Jamaican Parliament demanding reparations. Whereas when Mr. Modi went to England, as his speechwriter kindly told me, he had one sentence saying, "Others have addressed the issue of historical wrongs," which I was told was meant for me. And then he went on to say, "But let us look at the future," which indeed is the right thing to do.
Yeah. Now, thank you, Shashi. I think you've touched upon some very interesting points. I think the first point is that when it came to the question of the loss of political sovereignty, there was a complete unanimity as far as India was concerned that this was unacceptable for the future governance of this country. And there was, whether from the left or from the right, whether they were Gandhians or whether they were revolutionaries, they all agreed that this loss of political sovereignty must be addressed. There was also a reasonable amount of agreement that British rule had led to a degree of impoverishment of the country, of the economy. But then comes the paradox. And this is something I want both of you to address. When it came to considering the alternative of what sort of India are we going to build after independence, invariably the thrust was towards restoring the Britishness of British rule, to sort of paraphrase Dadabhai Naoroji in some way. In other words, all the institutions of empire were replicated more or less as far as India is concerned, which gives credence to that very controversial dedication of Nirad Chaudhuri in 1953, for which Nehru hounded him, partly because it was so true. And he dedicated it to the memory of the British Empire in India, which conferred subjecthood on us, but withheld citizenship. But for which all that was great and living within us was shaped and quickened by the same British rule. Now here we have this paradox of a bad empire, but we replicate the institutions of the empire. So it can't be all that bad, Tristram. I mean, should post-colonial angst dominate so much of the contemporary British consciousness?
Well, I left this wonderful festival the other day to go and look at the Albert Hall and the extraordinary architecture that Swinton Jacobs pulled together, the Indo-Saracenic designs, drawing on indigenous styles, drawing on Venetian Gothic, and pulling together this extraordinary building. And the number of Indian families having their picture taken, enjoying this architecture, enjoying this culture, that this was part of their heritage, seemed to me a very natural reflection on a layering of history which is now part of the Indian story. And I'm always struck when I go to the Houses of Parliament in New Delhi, the degree to which the institutions and structures and systems of the British Houses of Parliament are replicated in New Delhi, down to, I even saw them having fish and chips on the canteen lunch. And I thought this was a step too far.
As a vegetarian, I agree.
Although I hear your subsidy has been removed as well, so these things are. But as a historian of cities of the British Empire, I was certainly struck by the degree to which the institutions and physical space of New Delhi was then subsumed and taken over by an independent India. And as I reflected the other day, when New Delhi was being built, the French Prime Minister, Pompidou, wandered the construction site with a smile on his face, saying, this will be the greatest ruin of them all. And it wasn't. It was immediately taken up. So I think, if you think of legacies of imperialism abroad, when you think of those elements that become over time the rule of law, that become over time effective parliamentary systems, that those are legacies which then take on a life of themselves in more autonomous sovereign nations.
Well, I'm not surprised that two of you in your sartorial choices are embodying the checkered past of the British. Because honestly, these institutions are not, in my view, necessarily to be grateful for. It's true, however, that just as the American revolutionaries in 1776 had openly declared they were fighting for the rights of Englishmen, so too were the Indian nationalists. And honestly, they couldn't imagine another system, because what they were fighting for from 1885 onwards was those institutions from which they had been excluded. This was the cry of the excluded for inclusion. And so, for example, when the Simon Commission came down in 1930 to explore very theoretically the idea of a future constitution for India, Clement Attlee, again a leader of Tristram's party, who was a member of the commission, reported in his diary that when he suggested to Indian nationalist leaders that India might be better off with a presidential system of government, he said they reacted with horror. It was as if I was offering them margarine instead of butter. This is Attlee. And the truth is that one of the reasons we're stuck with this parliamentary system, which in many ways is so ill-suited to the Indian national character and political genius, is precisely because it was the system that the British ran, and we were very well conditioned to look up to the British as the embodiment of everything. I mean, I still remember reading this amusing account of this Indian who went to England for the first time, I think as a student or in the 1890s, and he wrote back home to Calcutta, what an amazingly advanced race the English are. Even the shoeshine boy speaks English. You know? So the fact is that English was already associated in our minds with all these elite things and these things to be aspired to. So we aspired to those institutions. In the 1950s, a communist leader like Hiren Mukherjee wrote with great pride how Sir Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, visiting and observing the Indian Parliament in action, found it reminded him more of Britain than the Australian Parliament did. And for Hiren Mukherjee, this was an ultimate sign of approbation. Now, the truth is that these are things, I mean, yes, even today, when you have to vote affirmatively in a voice vote, you're supposed to shout aye rather than yes, or no rather than nay. But the fact is that that is very much from the British system. We still have the division lobbies. The shape of the chamber is very much modeled on what the British taught us was desirable. And on top of that, we have a situation in which we have created a system of governance that was invented in a tiny island nation. Today, even a country of only 60 million people, where each member of parliament represents about 100,000 people and can knock on every door if he's hardworking enough. And we've plonked it onto a country with enormous diversity, not merely ideological differences as they have in Britain, but extraordinary ranges of caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, costume and custom. And then we've expected the system to work even despite the challenges of coalition governance. And we've done this on top of that, where each MP is ending up representing an average of 2 million people. But obviously, it's physically impossible to be in touch with all of them or represent them the way a British MP can, Tristram.
Which, I mean, Shashi, I think British politics, in some ways, is becoming more Indian, because you...
My condolences.
No, we regard this as progress. Because the sort of centralised vision of the UK is now beginning to shift. And so we know this general election we had recently was not a UK general election. There was a general election in Scotland and England and Wales and Northern Ireland all at the same time. But the politics in each is so different. So the more federal system of India, the willingness to take on coalitions, much of that now is now affecting and influencing UK politics.
Well, Shashi, I mean, I'm just struck by the fact that all your references to how successfully Parliament ran were dated back to the 1950s. And I think that's not perhaps accidental, considering the behavior of some of your colleagues and your leaders in Parliament, which is, to say the least, very un-Westminster-like. But the
guess who started it?
No. You see, it's an interesting question. Who started it? In 1757, after Clive won the Battle of Plassey, there were celebrations in the streets of Calcutta by, according to contemporary accounts, the Hindu merchants of Calcutta celebrated. Are we going to take that as a starting point of empire?
Look, a lot of empire was built on treachery and bribery, and obviously a lot of people put their own personal commercial interests ahead of nationalist feeling.
Which is exactly how countries operate.
Correct. I mean, in fact, but Britain was particularly good at it. They did a calculation that there are only 22 countries in the entire world that Britain has never invaded or attacked. Out of 193 members of the United Nations, only 22 have a history of never being attacked by the British. Now, the British obviously went around conquering various places for their own benefit. We were ruled by the East India Company till 1857 from the Battle of Plassey onwards. And it was made a virtue of that they were actually distinct from the British Crown, that they were a private company. What was omitted is, of course, that on average, a quarter to a third of British MPs held stock in the East India Company, and they voted everything the East India Company needed, including giving them naval and artillery protection for their depredations in India. So the fact is that this was an exercise in rape and pillage and loot of a subject people for the naked commercial profit of those in power, namely the English. And yes, a few in India benefited financially from it, and they, of course, would have had reason to celebrate, but the vast majority of people ended up being poorer than their ancestors had been before the British came.
Yeah, well, you spoke about Nehru as being the preeminent voice of Indian nationalism, an assertion which ignores the role of Mahatma Gandhi, who I thought was the preeminent voice of Indian nationalism. But it has often been...
I meant voice in the sense of the intellectual content.
Oh,
Gandhiji was definitely the preeminent nationalist leader.
I see, Gandhiji didn't have intellect.
Oh, Swapan. Swapan is desperately trying to get a headline at my expense tomorrow. No, Swapan, Gandhiji had a great intellect, but in terms of the quantum of writings on nationalism and on the whole idea of India, Nehru has written far more and published far more than Gandhiji has.
No doubt the idea of India is something which we can explore another day. For the moment, let's look at these various contradictions, etc., as far as empire is concerned, our attitudes towards it. Tristram, do you find it has often been said that one of the reasons why India produced a leader like Mahatma Gandhi, with his fanatical commitment to nonviolence, was because India was ruled by the Britons rather than by the Belgians or by the Germans. In other words, the sheer brutality, which often was, of course, seen as a recriminations after 1857, didn't really translate in the latter part of the Victorian age, and alternative sensibilities developed. Now, does that explain why the separation between India and Britain has been marked by less rancor than would have happened to any other colonial power when they're withdrawn?
I think first of all, I do get the sense I'm interfering in an old college rivalry at some points. I won't let go too far. But I don't buy the argument that Neil Ferguson used to make that, you know, if the British weren't there, it would have been even worse, and the Germans were worse, and the Belgians were worse, and even the French were worse. I think some of the
French, I think, were better, but that's not right.
That's only because President Hollande is flying in this evening, you know. And I think British actions, not only in Bengal, not only with in terms of the famine, but actually in the later 19th century, in terms of their use of genocidal technology in the Middle East and elsewhere, actually the moral compass isn't particularly in Britain's favour there. But I think the story of Gandhi and the story then of the relationships of post-independent India and Britain are partly also because within Britain, and this is where it gets in a sense more complicated, you also have this extraordinary story of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. And so just at the same time in London, in Manchester, in Birmingham and everywhere, you have the great wealth of empire and the force of empire. Within civil society there, and within global civil society, you also have the beginnings of resistance and anti-imperialism. And I think that is particularly the case, and particularly on the left, if you look at the relationships with Keir Hardie, with Annie Besant, and all of those strong progressive relationships which are built around anti-imperialism between the labor movement, the Congress, and elsewhere, it seems to me that there is a level of sophistication and dialogue which means that in the aftermath of independence, the relationships are stronger.
Well, if I may just chip in on that, I mean, certainly I agree with Tristram that you can't really start comparing, competitive brutality. We can find examples. 1857 was so ruthlessly suppressed. There were entire towns and villages where civilians, men, women, and children were massacred by direct orders of British officers and massacred without any compunction. I think the estimate was about 13,000 innocent civilians were killed in the course of putting down the 1857 uprising.
Underestimate. It's probably more.
No, I'm not referring to soldiers, of course. Larger numbers of people in uniform were killed. So the point, and blown from the mouths of cannons and God knows what else. But the fact is that the British were also brutal. But that isn't it seems to me, the issue. There was brutality and it was imposed. The question that Neil Ferguson also fails to address is for whose benefit. You see, ultimately, the British did try to justify colonialism as part of a civilizing mission. And in all fairness, the best arguments that can be made for colonialism, aside from the English language and cricket, but it's the only two I'm prepared to accept myself. But the arguments that are made, you began, Tristan, though you didn't develop on it, talking about rule of law and so on. I mean, one of the biggest problems that I would have as an Indian responding to these various things is that there is a normal evolution in societies which would, in the normal course, have given India many of these things. I mean, Thailand developed railways and roads without ever having been colonized. You don't actually need foreigners to come here and oppress you in order to get the basic benefits of development. And the stark fact is that the impoverishment of India, why did the British come here? Because the country was prosperous and wealthy. Let's be honest. And also it was weak enough to be invaded. And they left it far, far, far worse than they'd found it by any economic yardstick. And some of the best work on this has been done by the late British economic historian Angus Maddison, who has given facts and figures which frankly are impossible to refute for India having been at one point 23% of the global GDP and ending up below 4, having had 23% of global trade and ending up at 0.2. And all of these things which frankly suggest that should not be the realm of the argument. Swapan said something very interesting about how there wasn't any rancor and recrimination. But even there, I would give credit to Mahatma Gandhi and the spirit of the Indian national movement. Nehru was asked by no less an imperialist than Winston Churchill on a visit to the UK in the mid-50s. Because Churchill, as you know, had bitterly opposed Indian independence till the very end. He had also been quite vile in some of his comments on Indian nationalist leaders. During the Great Bengal Famine, when the English asked, when conscience-stricken British officials told London that people were dying because of these policies, Churchill's only comment was to minute on the margin, why hasn't Gandhi died yet? I mean, that was the kind of attitude of this man. And then he asked Nehru, how is it that you have shown me no bitterness or recrimination? And Nehru replied, we were taught by a great man never to fear and never to hate. And I think that is a very, very great tribute to the spirit of Indian nationalism, rather than, it seems to me, to any imagined justices of British rule. I would often point out, since Tristram mentioned the French, there was an account I read, a 1943 newspaper article written by a slightly bemused American who sat next to a large black man on a flight in West Africa and asked him, where are you from? And this gentleman said, moi, je suis français. I'm French, with great pride. No Indian was ever empowered or enabled to make such a statement throughout the 200 years of British rule. So for Niraj Chadi to write that sycophantic and unctuous dedication that Swapan so lovingly quoted, I think was frankly contemptible, and Nehru was right to feel contempt for a man. Because after all, to say that everything that was good and living within him was quickened by British rule, well, maybe his mind needed a bit more quickening than one could entirely accept.
But there's one facet, Shashi, there's a very, very interesting point, your adulation of French colonial rule.
Only by I don't want any colonial rule by anybody, but they were not as bad.
But there's a complete destruction of traditional cultures which accompanied French rule all over Africa. I think it's something which we didn't experience.
But also the aftermath, in theory, the great French spirit of everyone being a Frenchman, a French woman as part of this great civilizing force. Actually, post-colonial and post-imperial Britain is a much more successful multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society than France. Britain has developed a much more, I think, cohesive sense of an acceptable civic identity which embraces far more many peoples and cultures than France does, even though, so behind the French rhetoric, actually, incredible levels of racism.
Granted. I mean, we're not going to demonize you entirely, Tristram.
I think the final point...
We can always demonize the French. It's a sort of common,
the final point before we move to the questions is, and I want to touch on something you said last about not hating. When we talk about empire, it's basically a conversation on how history is read, how history is perceived almost 70 years after independence, both in Britain as well as in India. And I find that whereas that rancor did not exist among the political classes, the participants of those who were so involved, I think a lot of that bitterness and acrimony, distortion, caricature, etc., seems to have been translated into the conversations on history and has produced a strange sort of parody of what should continue. And I think the importance of using empire as just as a litmus test of whether at all sensible history can be written in India or even in Britain with the sort of Rhodes must fall syndrome having a role there. Do you think it's at all possible now? Don't wear your political hat, wear your hat as a historian or someone sensitive to history. And
I mean, I think there's a cycle to these. If you think of the history and understanding of the Holocaust, there wasn't that great engagement with the history of the Holocaust in the 1950s and 1960s. Actually, it takes a generational shift and a reflection then to begin to think about it, because people are just forging ahead. People are focusing on the future. They're not reflecting upon the trauma. As society changes, as generations shift, then the appreciation of that history begins to change. I think in terms of where the UK is and an understanding of history, we are at last beginning, to speak to Shashi's point about his friend the child in London not learning about imperial history. We are at last putting this subject properly on the syllabus, because all we've taught our young people for the last 10 to 15 years is about World War II and Stalin's Russia. They have incredible detailed knowledge of the burning down of the Reichstag, but their understanding of Britain's place in the world and imperial history is minimal. And I think it's holding them back in terms of their education as citizens of the world. So I think there's a very good appreciation of it now in our education system, but the levels of knowledge in your everyday school across the United Kingdom is in an absolutely parlous state. But it doesn't surprise me that now we're looking at that history if we weren't in the 1950s and early 60s.
Yeah, I think that we certainly need to revive an interest in history. I'm certainly struck by how many young people I speak to today are only studying science or mathematics and want to become engineers or computer scientists. That's all very well. But there is, I think, increasingly a danger that we forget our own past, what has made us what we are. We have not been terribly good at preserving our past, let's face it. I mean, unlike many societies in India, we have not preserved our great traditions, our great buildings, our great manuscripts. I mean, I think we probably have less than 10% of Kalidas's works, and had we somehow been a society that preserved them, we would have had a figure who would have rivaled Shakespeare at the very least, if not more so. But we've lost so much. I mean, we've lost so much of our past. It seems to me that with all the advantages of modern technology, we owe it to ourselves as a society to preserve our past. It will be contested terrain, the past always is. In a number of my novels, I've asked the question, is there my history and your history? Look at the contested narratives on the Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid, for example. And then look at some who are trying to undo what they see as the perceived injustices of the past at the expense of the later generations of the future. I mean, these are all fundamental issues that are not going to go away. But the least we owe ourselves as a civilization is to study the subject well enough, to be aware of it, to know what trends went into it, to draw our own conclusions. We are a vigorous democracy where there will always be differences of opinion, but at least let them be relatively well-informed differences. Let them be differences based on some genuine understanding of what happened, and then we can move forward through the popular processes of democracy and let the electorate decide which view should be allowed to prevail. But yes, to that degree, I agree completely with Tristram and implicitly with Swapan that we need to be able to recover history, to make sure it's taught, to make it compulsory, and particularly to encourage the habits of mind that will enable our young people to form their own opinions on the basis of facts rather than come up with their own facts on the basis of their opinions, which is what we're seeing more and more on the internet these days.
Yep. Well, I think we'll start the question and answer session. We'll leave it to the audience, but there's something intriguing, which is Hindustan Times has sponsored something called the Question of the Day. Now, I know sponsorships take various forms, but this is an interesting one, and it's been done through Twitter, and I think they have the prerogative and the privilege of asking the first question. The question is, not a very great question, don't you think it would be better to let bygones be bygones instead of asking for reparations because of the empire? Where does it stop? I suspect it's a question which is addressed more to Shashi, who demanded, incidentally, a £1 reparation till which year?
I said 200 years of £1 each, just to remind the Brits that they owed us something for what they'd done. And that much they can afford, despite all the cruel things we've heard said about the British economy of late.
1.5%.
No, jokes apart.
Invest to spend.
Jokes apart, I really did make it very clear I was not in favor of trying to quantify. In fact, an Indian columnist on the internet, a very pro-government columnist, actually did a calculation and said that Britain should pay some 3.4 trillion pounds or something, which, that it points to the absurdity and the futility of that kind of argument, because obviously Britain can never pay 3.4 trillion pounds. We probably wouldn't know what to do with all that money if we got it. But even to the point is that that's not what this is all about. I genuinely believe that history cannot be undone. The past is in the past. It haunts our present and can infect our future. So we have to be aware of it. But, and that's where I would make it, the question says, shouldn't we let bygones be bygones and not ask for reparations? My answer is no and yes. Yes, we shouldn't be asking for vast sums of money from the British. In fact, we should even end the British aid program for
You don't
the
have to ask, they've ended it themselves.
They've ended it. And let them give aid to poor people directly through NGOs. They don't have to give anything to the government of India, which surely has the resources. But the more important thing is, can we afford to let bygones be bygones? Only in the sense of not acting out of bitterness or hatred today, because of things the ancestors of today's Englishmen did. That, I think, would be foolish. But letting bygones be bygones in the sense of forgetting what happened? No, I would never agree to that. We must remember.
Yeah.
The unenviable position.
No, I would.
I mean, don't feel constrained by your passport.
I would agree with much of that. I don't think we should let bygones be bygones. We should interrogate bygones. We should reanalyze bygones. We should reinterpret it. Every generation comes to historical figures and historical events in different ways and formats, and we need to understand that. But I'm skeptical of some of the reparations argument, just as I am skeptical of official apologies and apologizing for the acts of predecessors. I think that when Tony Blair apologised for the Irish potato famine, and apologize for the role of the British in the trade in slaves. I fail to see how that takes the argument forward. It's often a dead end in terms of an argument. And similarly, some of the sort of the legal approach to history, the lawsuits, the official apologies, the inquiries, history seems to me a much more fluid and interactive process. And where you have that kind of governmentality around it, you begin to close off an understanding.
Right, let's... That lady out there. No, sir, behind you. No.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd just like to say it's really an honor to speak before such distinguished people. So my question is that even as you say, we should look to the future and, we remember and respect our past, but as Mr. Modi says, look to the future. So my question is that, do you think imperialism is justified in the end? As just to sum it up, that even with the advantages and disadvantages it gave, is it justified?
Well, the answer is no. But I would, as a historian, I'm afraid, complexify the question, because were the English in Scotland involved in imperialism? Were the English in Ireland involved in imperialism when it then becomes part of the same country? Were the Americans who went west involved in an act of imperialism? Is China today involved in imperial adventures? So the nature of imperialism is sometimes in the eye of the beholder. But, were the British justified in the extraordinary expropriation of riches from Bengal? You would here and now today say no.
Yeah, just to add one sentence to that, honestly, it's a fact of history. There were empires created various times. I'm not sure that it's our place now to rewrite the past. There are many people in our country who are trying to take their revenge upon history. But history is its own revenge. The way the world evolves, the way countries evolve, we'll find our own future.
Very exhilarating morning, gentlemen. My simple question to the panel, particularly Shashi Tharoor Esquire, if I may use that way. What if the British had not set their foot onto India in the 19th century? How do you visualize the scenario without the British not at all coming here? Who were here? Who would have come? What might have happened? And the second question, sir,
No,
you
so
seem...
we'll keep it to one so that we can sort
it's
of
a
democratize the question and answer.
That's what I relate to.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a fascinating question.
All right.
Counterfactual history.
Counterfactuals of history are always fascinating, but they're entirely a theoretical exercise. I think that the yearning for national and civilizational unity has existed in India since the days of Ashoka. Every emperor and warrior attempted to conquer large stretches of the subcontinent bounded by the Himalayas and the seas. And if no foreign interference had occurred, I think the likelihood is that some sort of arrangement would have evolved. In much of northern India, the arrangement that was evolving was a token Mughal monarch, a constitutional monarch, if you like, though there weren't any constitutions in those days, propped up by the force of Maratha arms in much of northern India. The Marathas, as you know, essentially propped up a weak Mughal in Delhi, and their power extended almost as far as what is today Calcutta and almost as far south as what's today Hyderabad. My own view is that India would have found a large measure of territorial unity simply because 2,000 years of history have shown us a succession of monarchs trying and failing to a greater or lesser degree to bring about that unity. And we would have had an India conceivably slightly different in borders from the India we have today, but very much an India that would have united these various forces. I'm sure we would have had railways, we would also have had roads, perhaps broader ones than the British left us with. But I hope we would not have had the British parliamentary system to curse as each day goes by.
Okay, before that headline starts dominating of Shashi denouncing parliamentary democracy, the gentleman there.
Not democracy, just the parliamentary system. I've said on record I prefer the presidential one. Yeah.
My question is to Mr. Shashi Tharoor. You said, gentleman oppressor French. Then why African revolutionary launched successful movements against the French?
Yes, yes. I've read Frantz Fanon and I've read...
Number two, please. You are talking about the 200 years of slavery of the Britisher, but we and all liberals are shy about the 1,000 years of slavery of jihadi Muslim slavery against the India.
Okay.
Why?
Right.
No, there's a big difference between conquerors who've come here and absorbed themselves into the country and into the local population, and those who've come from outside, took their loot and their profits outside and worked for the benefit of a foreign country. Big difference.
I know I'm being very arbitrary with the question, selecting the questions, but that's inevitable. Okay.
Hello. I've had the pleasure of working for the last couple of years in India, and the Indians I've met on all levels have had an amazing sense of self-confidence in who they are, and a sense of identity which the British should be envious of, because we are the ultimate mongrel race. And rather than arriving here and finding deference for my Englishness and my accent, I have discovered that the British Raj has disappeared in the sands of time, and what is left is it's India. Now, my question is, do you think anti-imperialism is just a political tool? Because I don't see it in the India that I see today.
Tristram, what's your observation from the outside?
Well, I think you can't exclude a phenomenally important 200-year period of Indian history as just disappearing into the sands of time. For good or bad, it is part of the story of modern India, and Kolkata or Mumbai would not be the cities, or Chennai or would not be the cities they are without that interaction, exchange, and diffusion. And then it's a question, I think, of how you understand and analyze that history. But where I would absolutely agree is that the level of confidence and sense of identity, which is obviously disputed in the politics, is much more vocal and forward-looking than some of the introspection in the UK at the moment.
Someone from the back. In any case, I think British imperialism has been replaced by American imperialism as the favorite punching bag.
This is a question for Mr. Tharoor. While the empire ended, I think we just replaced our masters. The Britishers went away and we have our new political masters. A lot of this discussion went around the moral compass. What should have been done if you went acted as per your morals. And I see the same thing today. Divide and rule. Corruption is taking money from the people and going into the pockets of the few. So I have a question for you, and I actually asked you this by email, never got a reply or an acknowledgement.
That surprises me. You must have had the wrong email ID.
So here's my question, sir.
Record.
Here's my question, sir. How does your personal moral compass allow you to be a member of the Congress party, which has been the most corrupt party in the history of this country?
A tough political audience, huh? No, let me say first of all that the case is not only moral, though obviously moral outrage informs much of one's case when one looks at iniquity and injustice. Second, that I completely concede there's a lot of iniquity and injustice within our own society, including the realities of caste oppression, that there is corruption, there is wrongdoing. I do not accept that any one particular party has a monopoly on virtue or on sin, because sadly, the experience of Indian democracy has demonstrated that corruption has infected pretty much every political institution and every political party without exception. I have seen this happening from a perch outside. When I left the country in 1975 as a 19-year-old to go to the graduate school in the States, I could truthfully say that nobody in my family had ever paid a bribe or been complicit in any act of corruption. Coming back over the years on annual visits home, I found my parents reeling helplessly in the face of demands from various people who had the power to permit certain things, or to give you a phone connection, or restore your electricity, or all sorts of things. And that is what's going on. We speak about corruption as a political thing. I'm sorry, my friend. The vast majority of Indians suffer a corruption that has little to do with politics, that has to do with the pregnant working class woman who's entitled to deliver her child in a bed in a government hospital, but often has to deliver the child on the floor because she can't afford the bribe to get the bed. Or the widow who can't get her husband's pension papers processed without bribing a clerk. These are the kinds of tragedies, or the ordinary person who can't get the parents' death certificate for days on end without nothing else can work. These are the kinds of things
Shashi,
that seems
you've
to
made
me
your point,
that
Shashi.
represent the reality, the lived reality of corruption. And as far as politics is
Shashi,
concerned, I
Shashi.
joined the party because of the values and political principles it today incarnates.
No.
There's a longer answer, we can talk about it later,
There was one
since the alternatives seem to me quite appalling.
Yes. It's not. I mean, at the end of the day, there was a one-line answer. It's not that I like them more, it's like I hate the others even more. A very Gandhian assertion. Last comments finally from Tristram, and then it's absolutely the guillotine.
This is the moment where one politician feels for the other politician and swerves the question. I just want to end with a plea, really, because as the story of empire grows and develops and we understand it and think about it, I want to go back to Shashi's point about the extraordinary heritage and collections in this country, and the work that seems to me that needs to take place between heritage institutions and museums and universities, between India and Britain, and the extraordinary knowledge and talents which are there on either side. Our museums can benefit from your scholarship enormously. I feel that there are many museums in this country which can benefit from the revolution in design and approach and accessibility that has happened in British museums over the last 10 to 15 years. And as we think about this history, let's work together to make it more accessible and understandable to the public.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that there's just no time for further questions. But thank you so much, Shashi. Thank you, Tristram, for being such a sport, taking insolent questions and trying to answer them in your own way.